Hello and welcome to the Times of India. Finance Minister Arun Jaitley has just presented the budget for 2018. This is the last full budget of this NDA government before it goes into polls in 2019. To discuss more about the larger picture and what are the basic features in this budget, I've got with me Sanjeev Shankaran of the Times of India, who tracks political economy, and Rishabh Srivastava, who will be talking to us. I'll first go to Sanjeev. Sanjeev, what are the key takeaways of this budget?
The key takeaway from Finance Minister Arun Jaitley's budget speech was that the speech was oriented towards elections.
Elections.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he identified in his speech, where the emphasis was on a handful of areas which actually are areas where there is a serious problem and where there are also a lot of voters present. And I'll start with the most important area.
Okay.
That's agriculture.
Okay.
Out of every 100 people who work in India, 49 are from the agricultural sector.
Okay.
And that's why most of India's voters are also present.
Okay. Okay. Before we go into the details, we have a small graphic on agriculture, on what Finance Minister Arun Jaitley said. If you can just go through these points first and then go into the details.
So what he was trying to do is that he was saying that they're trying to create a framework to help farmers increase their income. That's a place where farmers have not really had a good time in the last 4 years in terms of their increase in income. So he's now gone back to the tried and tested method of using minimum support prices.
Okay.
And over and above that, I think they're also now trying to set up funds to prevent or to help farmers when prices fluctuate, as in they suddenly fall.
Okay, so farmers, pricing you're saying?
Yeah, price stabilization or high minimum price seem to be the basic pillars on which the whole strategy rests.
Okay. What else?
To me, these are the primary points. Beyond that, he said they would do other things to link farmers and so on. But those things take time, creating new institutions. So if something can take effect in a very short period of time, it is minimum support prices and price stabilization funds, which already exist in many states, but they need to work better.
Okay. But as far as the, I think I heard Arun Jaitley say that farmers will be paid more than the input cost.
Yeah. Now,
how exactly do you, describe an input cost?
See, today what happens is there is a separate government body called Commission of Agricultural Costs and Prices, which looks at a handful of states. Suppose there are only two commodities where it works well, MSP, that is wheat and rice in India. They fix it for other commodities, but it works well only for these two.
Okay.
They look at the average cost across regions where it's grown. They look at the amount of input costs to grow rice and wheat on each acre, and then they try and arrive at something that meets everybody's requirement. When he says, or when he said in his speech, he would try and provide 150% more, it's difficult to figure out what exactly does he mean. Will they continue with the same formula, but except that they will they'll make sure that the MSP is 150% more than what that commission suggests, or will they break it up into district-wise and try something? I mean, it sounds very complicated.
Okay. Let's go to Rishabh, who's here with us. Rishabh, Finance Minister Arun Jaitley spoke a lot about banks. What are these graphics that you have up here for?
So one of the biggest issues facing India right now is an investment crisis.
Okay.
And the reason this investment crisis, one part of this investment crisis is that banks are under huge arrest right now. Over here, what you see is the graph of the non-performing assets in banks. And as you can see, non-performing assets have been increasing. And in green here is the profits of public banks. So banks have suddenly become very, very unprofitable. And at the same time, what has been happening is that bank lending has declined significantly. So in red here, you can see the lending graph for banks to industries. And this has been less than zero for almost 18 months now. So this is a huge, huge problem that's facing the Indian ecosystem right now. And the implication of this has been that because banks are not lending as much as they used to, Indian companies have been going to public markets to raise money instead. And so what you can see here is that the ratio of public equity raise to GDP is one of the highest it has ever been.
Rishabh, can you just slightly maximize it? Yeah. No.
Right. And so what we see here is that this thing in green, which is the amount of money that companies rose, that companies raised from the public market as a proportion of GDP, this number is increasing largely because banks are not lending to companies. And with the new 10% long-term capital gains tax that Finance Minister Jaitley introduced today, it is unclear just where this invested money is going to come from. Because if banks don't lend money and if the public markets become unattractive for investors, the investing crisis in India might see a continuation.
Banks are not lending enough, Sanjeev. Is that a problem?
I'm going to connect what Rishabh said about banks to the other big aspect of the budget, which is again political in nature. I mean, budget itself is largely a political document. One is that there was a lot of emphasis on small industries, MSMEs. Because typically for every 100 rupees of sales that they have, they employ more people.
Okay.
Now that leads to jobs or the lack of good jobs in India, which really affect young people. Again, many of them are voters. India's got a very large young population. Now their problem is that, you remember one graph that Rishabh showed about companies raising money through stock market. MSMEs don't really benefit from this. It's only the bigger companies that do it. MSMEs are largely reliant on banks and their own source of fundings.
Okay.
Now, if banks are not able to lend because they're having problems, these people get affected. And when MSMEs get affected, young people looking for jobs get affected.
In the rural areas especially,
rural and even urban areas, a lot of young people. So now, no government wants young people to be unhappy. I mean, it's just bad for any society. So a lot of emphasis in the budget was on MSMEs. What ahead of the budget, they've tried to help banks out by, giving more capital through a roundabout mean, in the hope that they will start lending to MSMEs.
Okay.
So the budget really linked that part also to, if you add agriculture and MSMEs, you're really looking at a very political budget in one sense. But because these also happen to be places where there is an economic issue also.
So is it the sort of rural distress that we've been seeing?
Yeah, rural distress and MSMEs which are very badly affected in the demonetization period.
Okay, we are getting some comments also from people. Padmakar wants to know what is the tax exemption for a senior citizen now. Gayatri says, I think budget should make our available resources to be used fully. MD Rabiul Alam says, salaried people are not happy with this budget. Joseph says, burden on taxpayer. Vinay Vashish says, Jumlebazi budget. Sanjeev, can you take this question on tax exemption for senior citizens?
He's added some health, for their health outgo or their medical outgo. He's given some benefits for senior citizens. Now, he didn't get into too many details in the budget speech, so it's best to wait for the bill because
for the fine print.
Yeah, because the document. I mean, they'll give precise numbers on where you get the benefit. But for senior citizens, there's some additional concession for medical spending, or let me put it, health spending.
For health?
Yeah, health spending.
Okay, now let's just go to our second slide. We have, first one was on agriculture that we already discussed. Education, Sanjeev.
Now, again, this. I think the focus is good. I mean, to the credit of the finance minister, you should praise the government for actually focusing on education, because what we found out in the recent past is that there are many more Indians who are in school now, but they're really learning very little over there. And which means that when they come out of school and maybe at a later stage, they will be unemployable. So now there is a big effort to try and fix the system. Now
we've seen various reports on
various reports, so which includes scholarship, which includes a new set of schools which will be called Ekalavya Vidyalayas, which is reminiscent of something called Navodaya, which now is a fairly successful model.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of emphasis on teacher training through that B.Ed program.
Integrated
that
point,
I think this is a good, in terms of intent, this is really good because teachers are a very essential part of this entire framework.
Okay. Let's go to Rishabh. Rishabh, we've got something else for us?
Right. So if you look at education, one huge issue in India is really secondary school education.
Okay.
And over here on the right, what we see this graph.
Yeah.
So India, this graph basically represents the percentage of secondary school students that have basic competency. And India is basically over here, which means that only 25% of Indian secondary school students have basic competency. And this compares to 90% for China, almost 100% for Japan, and around 85% for the United States. So moving forward, as we essentially want India to
Yeah,
become...
Rishabh, if you can just point where India is and where the likes of Japan and China.
Right, so India basically lies over here, which
Okay.
is just at about the 22% mark. Japan, China, Russia, and the United States are all comfortably more than 80%. So more than 80% of secondary school students have basic competency in these countries, while it's less than a quarter for India. So that really is a huge cause for concern. And we'll have to see how this budget and all the steps that this budget has taken improves the situation moving forward.
Okay, so let's go to the next slide. We've discussed education. We'll quickly go through the others. Health and living. Sanjeev, what new?
These are a very, very, very important part of the budget, which, I mean, I would just put it under a general category, dealing with something that is a serious cause for concern for a lot of Indians.
Okay.
That is a sudden and unexpected healthcare expenditure.
Yeah.
And also trying to make life a little easier.
Okay.
I think roughly about 10 years ago, the central government started a health insurance scheme. Over and above that, many states have their own scheme, which in many cases are probably far better than the central scheme, depending on which state, because they cover a greater number of ailments. Now, what they've done is they've taken that scheme and they've increased the insurance cover to 5 lakh. That's huge.
Okay.
5 lakh per family per year. And this will roughly cover 40% of the Indian population.
40%?
Maybe a little more than 40% of the Indian population. So it'll cover most people who would be classified as poor or very vulnerable.
Okay, so let me just put those points here.
Because I think the finance minister said roughly 10 crore families will be covered, and India would have approximately 24 crore families.
So health,
Yeah.
we are going to cover 10 crore families.
Yeah, under an insurance scheme.
Okay.
I mean, it's an extension of an existing insurance scheme, is my understanding. But the limit will be much higher. You can go up to 5 lakh a year per family.
Okay, this is an insurance scheme.
It's an insurance scheme. Over and above that, they want to start more hospitals, but all those things take time. I mean, you can't set up an AIM.
That's
overnight.
infrastructure.
Yeah,
so
infrastructure.
In infra, we can put.
The intent is there, but this is something that will kick in very quickly, an insurance scheme. Because you already have an existing insurance scheme, they have to increase the limit.
Okay, we are getting some more comments. We'll just take some comments before we proceed further. Sandeep Shea says, don't save, only spend is the mantra. He's not very happy. Arun Srinivas Iyengar says, typical Congress budget for elections. Interesting. Swapnil Khote wants to know, is there anything for the textile market? And Sadbir Singh has a question, how tax on equity affects SMEs and the IPO segment?
No, I think they've introduced long-term capital gains with some conditions.
Okay.
Again, we'll have to wait for the fine print, but that will affect people who hold shares, is my understanding from the budget speech. SMEs, they'll all have a turnover of less than 250 crore. They've brought down their effective tax rate to now, I think, about 25%.
So SME tax rate has come down.
Yeah, a tax rate has been coming down for a while. Now they've probably covered the entire SME sector with about 25% corporate tax or tax on profits.
Okay, so let's go to Rishabh. Rishabh, can we go back to the first slide? We were discussing about the banks, because I think, can you just, now we were discussing profitability and how the NPAs are going up. Can you just take us through it again?
Right, so what is happening here is that in this graph, what you can see is the non-performing assets of banks. So these are basically assets, maybe loans, maybe other investments, that there's a very high probability that they won't really be paid back. And so what we can see is that India was very, very successful in reducing this number in public banks until about financial year 2008, when these numbers were only about 4%. But what has happened in the years since, especially after FY15, is that this number has skyrocketed. So from about 5%, the non-performing asset ratio in public banks has increased 3 times to 15% right now. So this is really a cause for concern. And what has happened as a result of this is that even though the provisions of banks have increased, as you can see, they've almost doubled, the profits of banks have actually reversed. And instead, over the last 3 years, these banks have been making losses.
Okay, so the number in green is?
The number in green is the profitability
Okay.
of banks, and the number in blue is the provisions that these banks have.
Okay, okay. So, thank you, Rishabh, for that point. We'll come back to you. Like to go back to Sanjeev on the jobs front.
So jobs, Mudra again goes back to that MSMEs, which produce most of the jobs.
Yeah, yeah.
So they're trying to use the banks to push more money in that direction in the hope that it'll eventually create more jobs.
Okay.
Right? So that's why the budget had a very big, the speech had a very big MSME focus, because that leads to jobs and leads to young people eventually.
Okay, we've got some questions for us. Let me just see what they are. Basically, there are two sorts of questions that are coming up. One is, what are the benefits for salaried class? And the other is that anything new that we see in the social sector scheme?
I'll first take the salaried class thing.
Yeah.
There's some change in the taxation, direct taxation structure, where I think I remember there was an announcement of some standard deduction for conveyance and medical spending, I think healthcare spending. So effectively you can reduce your taxable income if you, through these two measures.
What are they?
Conveyance and health spending, I think. Or medical bills, if I'm not mistaken. But over and above that, the finance minister also announced that there would be a cess on healthcare and education to fund some of the schemes there on the social sector side. So we don't know to what extent these benefits will be taken away over there.
So there's going to be another cess.
Yeah, so again, we have to wait for the fine print to see exactly where the cess is going to come in what form.
Okay.
But there is a strong possibility that some benefits which come here will go away over here.
Okay.
Right? So net result, we don't know what's going to happen to the salaried class. We probably won't. It'll probably depend on your salary structure, the way your employer has structured your salary. If you have a much higher conveyance component, you'll probably escape. Otherwise, you're in trouble. Social sector is where there's a lot of emphasis in the budget speech, and that would go back to what we started with. There is a very strong political overtone to this budget because they're headed for elections next year. This is the last full budget, and as we have noticed in the recent assembly polls, rural India, in Gujarat particularly, rural Gujarat is where the BJP took a beating. One could say. I mean,
and in fact, even right now, as we speak, Congress is leading in the Rajasthan by-polls of Ajmer, Alwar, and the Mandalgarh Vidhan Sabha seat. So
they do have a problem in terms of their outreach to rural India, and this budget is trying to address some of those problems.
Okay, Sanjeev, some more questions. Pollution control and education to solve health cost is one question that we have. What about artificial intelligence learning for youngsters? Maverick Dhaval wants to know. And we have one more question saying that, Siddharth says, failure budget. Countdown has begun for Modi and BJP's downfall. On the one hand, we are saying that this is actually a political budget. So, will that actually tie in? Do you think that it's downhill for the Modi government?
I don't know if it's downhill for the Modi government, but after 4 years, typically there is a certain section of people who are going to be unhappy. Anti-incumbency does set in for everyone.
Okay.
Recent elections have shown that there is a class of people, or there is a segment of society which is quite unhappy. And I think this budget tries to address some of their problems. Whether it will succeed or not is another matter. Time will tell. I'll go back to that artificial intelligence in education. I mean, they've made some announcements, but I don't think in the larger context of Indian students, it's a very important, it makes a big difference because as Rishabh said, only 25 out of every 100 8th standard students are able to meet the 8th standard level.
Okay.
So that, is the primary problem with education today. And
Sanjeev, I would like to wrap up now. Just can you give us the highlights according to you? Just 3 or 4 highlights of this budget. We'll just put it down.
The big picture, it's a very political budget in terms of its speech.
It's a political budget, okay.
So tries to address 2 categories who are linked. One is agriculture.
Okay.
And the other is young people through the job front.
Youth through jobs.
Okay. different. I mean, if you're looking for common threads, so these and third factor is trying to address concerns of a lot of Indians who've got very uncertain income through healthcare benefits, through an health insurance.
Health insurance.
So these are the three factors. So you have the poorer people being addressed through health insurance, because you're dealing with only 10 crore families. Young people who are looking for jobs and unhappy, who are being through MSMEs, and agriculture through price support.
Okay. Your last comments, Rishabh, is there anything you want to add?
So just one last point, which is looking forward to the longer run, and really like this budget is not just for 2018, but it really shapes India for the next few years. One of the other issues in India is R&D expenditure.
Right.
Now, Minister Jaitley talked a lot about grants for researchers, but in this graph what you see is that India is basically one of the few countries in the world where government spending on research is much less than private spending.
Can you point out and show us the comparison with just your fingers? What is the red for?
Right. So red stands for government spending as a proportion of overall research spending. And as you can see, India is really the only country where red is a very dominant position. And for India to really increase and go beyond just farms and MSMEs and really create those huge industries where a lot of jobs are created, what we need to do is we need to increase this blue bar. And so what we really should be looking at is how does this budget increase the propensity of private companies to invest more in research?
So public-private partnership is...
Public-private partnerships or simply incentives. Incentives for private companies to spend. Okay. And again, we'll have to look at the fine print to see if that was the case. But in Minister Jaitley's speech, this was a point that wasn't really properly addressed.
Well, thanks so much, Rishabh and Sanjeev, for joining us. So there you have it. These are the first thoughts. Of course, we'll have to wait for the fine print to see what about the details. But it is definitely a political budget. It is aimed at farmers. It is aimed at youths to provide jobs. And for the poorer section, a health insurance that will cover almost 10 crore people. Do stay tuned into the Times of India for live updates. But for the moment, thank you.